The Little Mermaid. Far out at sea, the water is as blue as the petals of the prettiest cornflowers, and as clear as the purest glass. But it's very deep out there, so deep that even the longest anchor line can't touch bottom. You would have to pile up countless church steeples, one on top of the other, to get from the bottom of the sea all the way up to the surface. The sea people live down there. Now you mustn't think for a moment that there is nothing but bare white sand down there. Oh no. The most wondrous trees and plants grow at the bottom of the sea, with stalks and leaves so supple that they stir with life at the slightest ripple in the water. The fish everywhere, large and small, dart between the branches, just the way birds fly through the trees up here. At the very deepest spot of all stands the castle of the Sea King. Its walls are coral, and the tall, arched windows are made of the clearest amber. The roof is formed of shells that open and close with the current. It's a beautiful sight, for each shell has a dazzling pearl, any one of which would make a splendid jewel in a queen's crown. The Sea King has been a widower for many years, and his aged mother kept house for him. She was a wise lady, but also very proud of her noble birth. That's why she wore 12 oysters on her tail, while everyone else of high rank had to settle for 6. In every other way she deserved great praise, for she was deeply devoted to her granddaughters, those sea princesses. There were 6 beautiful children, but the youngest was the fairest of them all. Her skin was as clear and soft as a rose petal. Her eyes were as blue as the deepest sea. But like all the others, she had no feet, and her body ended in a fishtail. All day long, the sea princesses played in the greatest hall of the castle, where real flowers were growing right out of the walls. When the large amber windows were open, fish swam right in, just as swallows fly into our homes when we open the windows. The fish glided up to the princesses, ate out of their hands, and let themselves be caressed. Outside the castle there was an enormous garden with trees that were deep blue and fiery red. Their fruit glittered like gold, and their blossoms looked like flames of fire, with leaves and stalks constantly aflutter. The soil itself was the finest sand, but blue like a sulphur flame. The wondrous blue glow permeated everything in sight. Standing down there, you really had no idea that you were at the bottom of the sea, and you might as well have been high up in the air with nothing but sky above you and below. When the sea was perfectly calm, you could catch sight of the sun, which looked like a purple flower with light streaming from its calyx. Each little princess had her own plot in the garden, where she could dig and plant as she pleased. One arranged her flower bed in the shape of a whale. Another thought it nicer to make hers look like a little mermaid. But the youngest made hers perfectly round like the sun, and she wanted nothing but flowers that shone just as red as it was. She was a curious child, quiet and thoughtful, while her sisters decorated the gardens with the wondrous objects that they had gathered from sunken ships. She wanted only one thing apart from the rose-red flowers that were like the sun high above: a beautiful marble statue. The statue was of a handsome boy, chiseled from pure white snow, and it had landed on the bottom of the sea after a shipwreck. Next to it, the little princess had planted a crimson weeping willow that grew splendidly, draping its fresh foliage over the statue and touching the blue, sandy ocean bottom. It cast a violent shadow that, like its branches, was in constant motion. The roots and crown of the tree seemed always at play with each other, as if trying to kiss. Nothing made the princess happier than learning about the human world above. She made her grandmother tell her everything she knew about ships and towns, people and animals. She found it strangely beautiful that flowers up on the land had a fragrance. At the bottom of the sea they had none, and also that the trees in the forest were green, and that the fish flying in the trees up there sang so clearly and beautifully that it was delightful to listen to them. Grandmother called the little birds fish, because otherwise the little sea princesses, never having seen a bird, would have no idea what she was talking about. When you turn 15, Grandmother told them, you'll be allowed to swim up to the surface of the sea, to sit on the rocks in the moonlight, and watch the tall ships that pass by. You will also have the chance to see both forests and towns. In the coming year, one of the sisters was going to turn 15, but the others, well, they were each born a year apart. And the youngest of them had to wait 5 whole years before she could venture up from the depths to see how things looked up here. But each promised to tell the others what she had seen and what she had liked the most on that first visit. Their grandmother had not told them nearly enough, and there was so much that they still wanted to know. No one longed to go up more than the youngest sister, the one who was so silent and thoughtful, and who also had the longest wait. Many a night she would stand at the open window and gaze up through the dark blue waters, where the fish were fluttering their fins and tails. She could see the moon and the stars, even though their light shone rather pale. Through the water they looked much bigger than they do to our eyes. If a black cloud passed beneath the stars, she knew that it was either a whale swimming overhead or a ship filled with many passengers. The people on board never imagined that a pretty little mermaid was waiting below, stretching her white arms toward the keel of the ship. As soon as the eldest princess turned 15, she was allowed to swim up to the surface. When she returned, she had hundreds of things to report. The loveliest moment, she said, was lying on a sandbar close to the shore in the moonlight while the sea was calm. From there, you could see a city. Its lights were twinkling like 100 stars. You could hear the sounds of music and the commotion of carriages and people. You could see all the church towers and spires and hear their bells ringing. And because she could not get close to all those wonderful things, she longed for them all the more. Oh, how the youngest sister drank it all in. And later that evening, while she stood at the open window gazing up through the dark blue waters, she thought of the big city with all its hustle and bustle, and she even fancied that she could hear the church bells ringing down to her. The following year, the second sister was allowed to rise up through the water and swim wherever she liked. She reached the surface just as the sun was setting, and that, she said, was the loveliest sight of all. The whole sky was covered in gold, she declared, and the clouds, well, she just couldn't describe how beautiful they were, with their crimson and violet hues as they sailed over her head. Even more rapidly than the clouds, a flock of wild swans flew like a long white veil across the water toward the setting sun. The second sister swam off in that direction, but the sun sank, and its rosy glow was swallowed up by the sea and the clouds. Another year passed, and the third sister swam up to the surface. She was the most daring of them all, and she swam upstream into a wide river that flowed into the sea. She could see beautiful green hills covered with grapevines. Castles and manors peeked out from magnificent woods. She could hear birds singing, and the sun was so hot that she had often had to dive underwater to cool off her burning face. In a small cove, she came upon a whole troop of human children, jumping around, quite naked, in the water. She wanted to play with them, but they were terrified and fled. Then a little black animal appeared. It was a dog, but she had never seen one before. The animal barked so ferociously at her that she became frightened and headed for the open sea. But she would never forget the magnificent woods, the green hills, and the darling children, who could swim even though they lacked tails. The fourth sister was not nearly as daring. She stayed far out in the wild ocean and declared that it was the loveliest place of all. You could see it for miles and miles around, and the sky overhead was like a big glass bell. She had seen ships, but at a distance so great that they looked like seagulls. Dolphins were sporting in the waves, and enormous whales spouted water so powerfully from their nostrils that they seemed to be surrounded by 100 fountains. And now it was the fifth sister's turn. Since her birthday was in the winter, she saw things others had not seen on their first outings. The sea had turned quite green, and there were large icebergs floating in it. Each one looked like a pearl, she said, and they were still larger than the church steeples built by humans. They appeared in the most fantastic shapes and glittered just like diamonds. She sat down on one of the largest, and all the ships seemed terrified, giving her a wide berth and sailing rapidly past. She stayed put, with the wind blowing through her long hair. Later that evening, the sky became overcast. Thunder rolled, and lightning flashed, and the dark waves lifted great chunks of ice high into the air, making them gleam when bolts of red lightning struck. The sails were taken in on all the ships, but amid the general horror and alarm, the mermaid remained serene on her drifting iceberg, watching blue lightning bolts zigzag down toward the glittering sea. When any one of the sisters reached the surface for the first time, she would be delighted by the many new and beautiful things up there. But as the princesses grew older and were allowed to go up as often as they liked, they began to lose interest. They longed to return home, and after a month had passed, they declared that it would be really much nicer down below. It was such a comfort to be at home. Many an evening, the five sisters would link arms to form a row and rise up out of the water. They had lovely voices, more beautiful than the sound of any human voice. If a storm was raging and they expected a shipwreck, the sisters would swim in the front of the vessels and sing seductively about the delights found in the depths of the sea. They told the sailors not to be afraid to go down there, but the sailors never understood the words they sang. They thought they were hearing the howling of the storm, nor did they ever see the beauty promised by the mermaids, because when their ships finally sank, the sailors drowned, and by the time they reached the palace of the Sea King, they were dead. When the sisters floated up arm in arm through the water in the evening, the youngest among them would be left behind, all alone, gazing after them. She would have cried, but mermaids cannot shed tears, and so they suffer even more than we do. Oh, if only I were 15 years old, she would say. I know that I would come to love the world up there and all the people who live in it. Finally, she turned 15. Well now, soon we'll have you off our hands, said the old dowager queen, her grandmother. Come here, and let me dress you up like your sisters. And she put on a wreath of white lilies in her hair. Each flower petal was half a pearl, and the old woman clamped 8 big oysters onto the princess's tail to show her high rank. Ow, that really hurts, said the Little Mermaid. Yes, beauty has its price, the grandmother replied. Oh, how the mermaid would have loved to shake off all that finery and remove that heavy wreath. The red flowers in her garden would have suited her so much better, but she did not dare make any change. Farewell, she said, as she rose up through the water as swiftly and brightly as a bubble moves up to the surface. The sun had just set when her head rose up through the waves, but the clouds were still gleaming like roses and gold. Up in the pale pink sky, the evening star was shining bright and clear. The air was mild and fresh, and the sea was perfectly calm. A tall, three-masted ship was drifting in the water, with only one sail hoist because there was not so much as a breeze. The sailors could be seen taking it easy on the rigging and in the masts. There was music and singing on board, and when it grew dark, hundreds of colored lanterns were lit. They made it look like the flags of all the nations were fluttering in the wind. The Little Mermaid swam right up to the porthole of the cabin, and every time a wave lifted her, she could see a throng of elegantly dressed people through the clear glass. Among them was a young prince, the handsomest person there, with big dark eyes. He couldn't have been more than 16. It was his birthday, and that's why the festivities were taking place. When the young prince came out on the deck, where the sailors were dancing, more than 100 rockets were shot into the air. They lit up the sky, making it look like daytime, and the Little Mermaid was so startled that she dove back down into the water. But she quickly popped her head back out again. It looked just as if all the stars up in heaven were falling down on her. Never before had she seen such fireworks. Huge suns were spinning around. Magnificent firefish went swooping through the blue air, and the entire display was reflected in the clear, calm waters below. The ship itself was so brightly illuminated that you could see even the smallest piece of rope, not to mention all the people there. How handsome the young prince looked. He shook hands with everyone, laughing and smiling as music filled the lovely night air. It was growing late, but the Little Mermaid could not tear herself away from the ship or from the handsome prince. The colored lanterns had long been extinguished. The rockets were no longer being fired into the air, and the cannon volleys had stopped. Now you could hear the sea churning and groaning deep down below. Still, the mermaid stayed on the surface, bobbing up and down so that she could look into the cabin. The ship began gathering speed as one sail after another caught the wind. The waves rose higher, heavy clouds darkened the sky, and lightning flashed in the distance. A dreadful storm was brewing, and so the crew took in the sails, while the great ship rocked and scudded through the raging sea. The waves rose higher and higher until they were like huge black mountains, threatening to bring down the mast. The ship dove like a swan between the waves, and then rose again on their lofty, foaming crests. The Little Mermaid thought it would be fun to sail so fast, but the crew didn't think so. The vessel groaned and creaked. The stout planks burst under the heavy pounding of the sea against the ship, and the mast snapped in two as if it were a reed. The ship rolled onto its side as water came rushing into the hold. The Little Mermaid suddenly realized that the ship was in real danger. She herself had to watch out for the beams and bits of wreckage drifting in the water. For an instant, it was so dark that she couldn't see a thing. But then a flash of lightning lit everything up so that she could make out everyone on board. Now it was every man for himself. She was searching for the young prince, and, just as the ship broke apart, she saw him disappear into the depths of the sea. At first she was overjoyed, for she believed that he would now live in her part of the world. But then she remembered that human beings could not survive underwater, and that only as a dead man could he come down to her father's place. No, he mustn't die. And so she darted in among the drifting beams and planks, oblivious to the danger of being crushed. She dove deep down and came right back up again among the waves, and at last she found the young prince, who barely had the strength to keep afloat in the stormy waters. His limbs were failing him, his beautiful eyes were shut, and he would surely have drowned if the little mermaid had not come to his rescue. She held his head above water and let the waves carry the two of them along. By morning the storm had died down, and there was not a trace left of the ship. The sun, red and glowing, rose up out of the water and seemed to bring color back into the prince's cheeks, but his eyes remained closed. The mermaid kissed his fine, high brow and smoothed back his wet hair. She thought that he looked just like the marble statue in her little garden. She kissed him again and made a wish that he might live. Soon, the little mermaid saw land before her, lofty blue mountains topped with glittering white snow that made them look like nestling swans. Near the coast were lovely green forests, and close by was some kind of building, whether church or cloister she could not say. Lemon and orange trees were growing in the garden, and you could see tall palm trees by the gate. The sea formed a small bay at this point, and the water in it was quite calm, though very deep all the way up to the dunes, where fine white sand had washed ashore. The little mermaid swam over there with the handsome prince, laid him down in the warm sunshine, and made a pillow for his head with the sand. Bells began ringing in the large white building, and a group of young girls came walking through the garden. The little mermaid swam farther out from the shore, hiding behind some large boulders that rose out of the water. She covered her hair and chest with sea foam so that no one could see her. Then she watched to see who would come to help the poor prince. It was not long before a young girl came by. She had a frightened look on her face, but only for a moment, and she quickly ran away to get help. The mermaid watched as the prince came back to life and began to smile at everyone around him. But there was no smile for her, because of course he had no idea that she had rescued him. After he was taken into the large building, she was overcome with sorrow and dove back into the water to return to her father's palace. The little mermaid had always been silent and thoughtful, but now she was even more so. Her sisters asked what she had seen during her first visit up above, but she did not say a word. Many a morning and many an evening she swam up to the spot where she had left the prince. She saw the fruits in the garden ripen and watched as they were picked. She saw the snow melt on the peaks, but she never saw the prince. And so she always returned home, filled with even greater sorrow than before. Her one consolation was sitting in her little garden, with her arms wrapped around the beautiful marble statue that looked so like the prince. She gave up tending her flowers, and they grew into a kind of wilderness out over the paths, winding their long stalks and leaves around the branches of the trees until everything became quite gloomy. Finally, she could bear it no longer and told one of her sisters everything. The others learned about it soon enough, but no one else knew about it, except for a few other mermaids who didn't breathe a word to anyone, apart from their closest friends. One of them knew who the prince was. She, too, had seen the festival held on board, and knew where the prince came from as well as where his kingdom lay. "Come, little sister," the other princesses said, and with their arms on each other's shoulders, they rose in one long row to the surface, right in front of where the prince's castle stood. The castle had been built with a gleaming pale yellow stone. It had grand marble staircases, one of which led straight down to the sea. Magnificent gilded domes rose above the rooftops, and between the pillars that surrounded the entire building stood lifelike marble statues. Through the clear glass of the tall windows, you could see the grand rooms decorated with sumptuous silk curtains and tapestries. The walls were covered with huge paintings that were a pleasure to behold, In the center of the largest room was a fountain that sprayed sparkling jets high up to the glass dome of the ceiling. The sun shone through it down on the water and on the beautiful plants growing in the large pool. Now that the little mermaid knew where the prince lived, she spent many an evening and many a night at that spot. She swam much closer to the shore than any of the others dared. She even went up the narrow channel to reach the fine marble balcony that threw its long shadow across the water. Here she would sit and gaze at the young prince, who believed that he was completely alone in the bright moonlight. Often in the evening, the little mermaid saw him go out to sea in his splendid vessel, with flags hoisted to the strains of music. She peeked out from among the green rushes, and when the wind caught her long, silvery white veil, and people saw it, they just fancied it was a swan, spreading its wings. On many nights, when the fishermen were out at sea with their torches, she heard them praising the young prince, and that made her all the more happy about saving his life on the day he was drifting half dead on the waves. And she remembered how she had cradled his head on her chest, and how loving she had kissed him. But he knew nothing about any of this, and never even dreamed she existed. The little mermaid grew more and more fond of human beings, and longed deeply for their company. Their world seemed far vaster than her own. They could fly across the ocean in ships, and climb the steep mountains high above the clouds. And the lands they possessed, their woods and their fields, stretched far beyond where she could see. There was so much she would have liked to know, and her sisters weren't able to answer all her questions. And so she went to visit her old grandmother, who knew all about the world above, which she quite rightly called the lands above the sea. If human beings don't drown, asked the little mermaid, can they go on living forever? Don't they die, as we do down here in the sea? Of course they do, the old one replied. They too must die, and their lifetimes is even shorter than ours. We sometimes live for 300 years, but when we cease to exist, we turn into foam on the sea. We don't even have a grave down here among our loved ones. We lack an immortal soul, and we shall never have another life. We're like the green rushes. Once they've been cut, they stop growing. But human beings have a soul that lives on forever, even after their bodies have turned to dust. It rises up through the pure air until it reaches the shining stars, just as we rise up from the sea to behold the land of humans. They rise up to beautiful unknown regions that we shall never see. Why weren't we given an immortal soul? The little mermaid asked mournfully. I would give all 300 years of my life in return for becoming human for just one day and having a share in that heavenly world. You mustn't waste your time worrying about these things, the grandmother told her. We're really much happier and also better off than the human beings who live up there. So then I'm doomed to die and to drift like foam on the sea, never to hear the music of the waves or see the lovely flowers and the red sun. Is there nothing I can do to gain an immortal soul? No, said the old woman. Only if a human loved you so much that you meant more to him than his father and mother. If he were to love you with all his heart and soul, and had the priest place his right hand in yours, with the promise of remaining faithful and true here and in all eternity, then his soul would glide into your body, and you two would share in human happiness. He would give you a soul and still keep his own, but that would never happen. Your fishtail, which we find so beautiful, looks hideous to people on earth. They don't know any better. To be beautiful up there, you have to have those clumsy pillars that they call legs. The little mermaid sighed and looked mournfully at her fishtail. Let's celebrate, said the old woman. Let's dance and be joyful for the 300 years we have to live. That's really quite time enough. After that, we have plenty of time to rest in our graves. Tonight, there will be a royal ball. That event was more splendid than anything we ever see on earth. The walls and ceiling of the great ballroom were made of thick, transparent crystal, Hundreds of colossal seashells, rose red and grass green, were lined up on all sides, each burning with a blue flame. They lit up the entire room, and by shining through the walls, also lit up the sea. Countless fish, large and small, could be seen swimming toward the crystal walls. The scales on some of them glowed with a purple-red brilliance. Others appeared to be silver and gold. Down the middle of the ballroom flowed a wide, rippling current, and in it mermen and mermaids were dancing to their own sweet songs. No human beings have voices so beautiful. The little mermaid sang more sweetly than anyone else, and everyone applauded her. For a moment there was joy in her heart, because she knew that her voice was more beautiful than any other on land or in the sea. But then her thoughts turned to the world above. She was unable to forget the handsome prince, or her deep sorrow that she did not possess the same immortal soul humans possess. And so she slipped out on her father's palace, and while everyone inside was singing and making merry, she sat in her own little garden, feeling sad. Suddenly, the little mermaid heard the sound of a hunting horn echoing down through the water, and she thought, "Ah, there he is, sailing up above, the one I love more than my father or my mother, the one who is always in my thoughts, and in whose hands I would gladly place my happiness. I would risk anything to win him and to gain an immortal soul. While my sisters are dancing away in father's castle, I'll go visit the sea witch. I've always been terrified of her, but maybe she can give me some advice and help me out." The little mermaid left her garden and set out for the place where the sea witch lived, on the far side of the roaring maelstroms. She had never been over there before. There was no flowers growing there, and no sea grass at all. Nothing was there but the bare, gray, sandy bottom of the sea, stretching right up to the maelstroms, where the water went swirling around like roaring mill wheels, and pulled everything it got hold of down into the depths. She had to pass through the middle of those churning whirlpools in order to reach the domain of the sea witch. For a long stretch, there was no other path than one that took her over hot, bubbling mud. The witch called it her swamp. The witch's house lay behind the swamp in the middle of a strange forest. All the trees and bushes were sea polyps, half animal and half plant. They looked like 100-headed serpents growing out of the ground. Their branches looked like long, slimy arms, with fingers like slithering worms, joint by joint from the root up to the very tip. They were consistent on the move, and they wound themselves tight around anything they could grab hold of from the sea, and then they would not let go. The little mermaid was terrified and paused at the edge of the wood. Her heart was pounding with fear, and she came close to turning back. But then she remembered the prince and the human soul, and her courage returned. She tied her long flowing hair tightly around her head so that the polyps wouldn't be able to grab hold of it. Then she folded her arms across her chest and darted forward like a fish shooting through the water, right in among the hideous polyps that reached out to snatch her with their nimble arms and fingers. She noticed how each of the sea polyps had caught something and was holding it fast with 100 little arms that were like hoops of iron. The white skeletons of humans who had perished at sea and sunk down into the deep waters became visible in the arms of the polyps. Ship rudders and chests were held in their grip, along with the skeletons of land animals, and, most horrifying of all, a small mermaid whom they had caught and throttled. She finally reached a great slimy clearing in the woods, where big fat water snakes were romping in the mire and showing off their hideous whitish yellow bellies. In the middle of the clearing stood a house, built with the bones of shipwrecked human folk. There sat the sea witch, letting a toad feed from her mouth, exactly the way you can feed a canary with a lump of sugar. She called the hideous water snakes her little chickadees and let them cavort all over her big, spongy chest. I know exactly what you want, the sea witch said. How stupid of you, but I'm going to grant your wish, and it will bring you misfortune, my lovely princess. You're hoping to get rid of that fishtail and replace it with two stumps to walk on like a human being. You're sure that the prince will then fall in love with you, and then you can win him along with an immortal soul. And with that, the witch let out such a loud, repulsive laugh that the toad and the water snakes tumbled to the ground and went sprawling. You've come here just in time, said the witch. Tomorrow, once the sun is up, I wouldn't be able to help you for another year. I shall prepare a potion for you. You will have to swim to land with it before sunrise. Sit down on the shore and swallow it. Your tail will then split into and shrink into what human beings call pretty legs. But it will hurt. It will feel like a sharp sword passing through you. Everyone who sees you will say that you are the loveliest human child they have ever encountered. You will keep your graceful movements. No dancer will ever glide so lightly. But every step you take will make you feel like as if you were treading on a sharp knife, enough to make your feet bleed. If you are willing to endure all that, I think I can help you. Yes, said the Little Mermaid, but her voice trembled, and she turned her thoughts to the prince and the prize of an immortal soul. Think about it carefully, said the witch. Once you take on the form of a human, you can never again be a mermaid. You'll never be able to swim back through the water to your sisters or to your father's place. The only way you can acquire an immortal soul is to win the prince's love and make him willing to forget his father and mother for your sake. He must cling to you always in his thoughts, and let the priest join your hands to become man and wife. If the prince marries someone else, the morning after the wedding your heart will break, and you will become foam on the waves. I'm ready, said the Little Mermaid, and she turned pale as death. But first, you will have to pay me, said the witch, and it's not a small thing that I'm demanding. You have a voice more beautiful than anyone else's down here at the bottom of the sea. You may be planning to charm the prince with it, but you are going to have to give it to me. I want the dearest thing you possess in exchange for my precious potion. You see, I have to add my own blood to make sure that the drink will be as sharp as a double-edged sword. But if you take away my voice, said the Little Mermaid, what will I have left? Your lovely figure, said the witch, your graceful movements, and your expressive eyes. With all that you can easily enchant a human heart. Well, where is your courage? Stick out your little tongue and let me cut it off in payment. Then you shall have your powerful potion. So be it, said the Little Mermaid, and the witch placed her cauldron on the fire to brew the magic potion. Cleanliness above everything else, she said, as she scored the cauldron with the water snakes, which she had tied into a large knot. Then she made a cut in her chest and let her black blood ooze out. The steam from the cauldron created strange shapes, terrifying to behold. The witch kept tossing fresh things into the cauldron, and when the brew began to boil, it sounded like a crocodile weeping. At last, the magic potion was ready, and it looked just like clean water. There you go, said the witch as she cut out the Little Mermaid's tongue. Now she was mute and could neither speak nor sing. If the polyps try to grab you on your way out through the woods, said the witch, just throw a single drop of this potion on them, and their arms and fingers will burst into 1,000 pieces. But the Little Mermaid didn't need to do that. The polyps shrank back in terror when they caught sight of the luminous potion glowing in her hand like a glittering star. And so she passed quickly through the woods, the marsh, and the roaring whirlpools. The Little Mermaid could now see her father's palace. The lights in the ballroom were out, and everyone was probably fast asleep by now. But she did not dare to take a look, for she could not speak and was about to leave them forever. Her heart was aching with sorrow. She stole into the garden, took a flower from the beds of each of her sisters, blew 1,000 kisses toward the palace, and then swam up through the dark blue waters. The sun had not yet risen when she caught sight of the prince's palace and made her way up in the beautiful marble steps. The moon was shining clear and bright. The little mermaid drank the bitter, fiery potion, and it felt to her as if a double-edged sword was passing through her delicate body. She fainted and fell down as if dead. When the sun came shining across the sea, it woke her up. She could feel a sharp pain, but right there in front of her stood the handsome young prince. He stared at her so intently with his coal black eyes that she cast down her own and saw that her fishtail was gone. She had as charming a pair of white legs as any young girl could want, but she was quite naked, and so she wrapped herself in her long, flowing hair. The prince asked who she was and how she had found her way there, and she could only gaze back at him tenderly and sadly with her deep blue eyes, for of course she could not speak. Then he took her by the hand and escorted her into the palace. Every step she took, as the witch predicted, made her feel as if she were treading on sharp knives and piercing needles, but she willingly endured it. Hand in hand with the prince, she moved as lightly as a bubble. He and everyone else marveled at the beauty of her graceful movements. She was given costly dresses of silk and muslin after she arrived. She was the most beautiful creature in the palace, but she was mute and could not sing or speak. Enchanting slave girls dressed in silk and gold came out and danced before the prince and his royal parents. One sang more beautifully than all the others, and the prince clapped his hands and smiled at her. The little mermaid felt sad, for she knew that she herself had once sung far more beautifully, and she thought, oh, if only he knew that I gave my voice away forever in order to be with him. The slave girls performed a graceful, swaying dance to the most sublime music, and the little mermaid raised her beautiful white arms, lifting herself up on the tips of her toes and floating across the floor, dancing as no one had ever danced before. She looked more and more lovely with every step, and her eyes spoke more deeply to the heart than the songs of the slave girls. Everyone was enraptured, especially the prince, who called her his little foundling. She kept on dancing, even though it felt like she was treading on sharp knives every time her foot touched the ground. The prince insisted that she must never leave him, and she was allowed to sleep outside his door on a velvet cushion. The prince had a page's costume made for her, so that she could ride on horseback with him. They galloped through fragrant woods, where green willows brushed her shoulders, and little birds sang among the fresh new leaves. She climbed with the prince to the tops of high mountains, and although her delicate feet began to bleed and everyone could see the blood, she just laughed and followed the prince until they could look down and see clouds fluttering in the air like flocks of birds on their way to distant lands. At night, back in the prince's palace, when everyone in the household was fast asleep, the little mermaid would go over to the marble steps and cool her burning feet by standing in the icy sea water. And then she would think about those who were living down there in the deep. One night, her sisters rose up and sang mournfully as they floated arm in arm on the water. She beckoned to them, and they recognized her and told her how unhappy she had made them all. From then on, they started visiting her every night. And one night she even saw, far off in the distance, her old grandmother, who had not been up to the surface for many years. And she also saw the old Sea King, wearing his crown on his head. They both stretched their arms out towards her, but they did not dare to venture as close to the shores as their sisters. With each passing day, the prince grew fonder of the little mermaid. He loved her as one loves a dear, sweet child, and it never even occurred to him to make her his queen. And yet she had to become his wife, or else she would never receive an immortal soul. On his wedding morning, she would dissolve into foam on the sea. Do you care for me more than anyone else? The little mermaid's eyes seemed to ask when he took her in his arms and kissed her lovely brow. Yes, you are more precious to me than anyone else, said the prince, for you have the kindest heart of anyone I know, and you are more devoted to me than anyone else. You remind me of a young girl I once met, but shall probably never see again. I was in a shipwreck, and the waves cast me ashore near a holy temple, where several young girls were performing their duties. The youngest of them found me on the beach and saved my life. I saw her just twice. She is the only one in the world whom I could ever love. But you look so much like her that you have almost driven her image out of my mind. She belongs to the holy temple, and my good fortune has sent you to me. We will never part. Ah, little does he know that it was I who saved his life, thought the little mermaid. I carried him across the sea to the temple in the woods, and I waited in the foam for someone to come and help. I saw the beautiful girl that he loves better than he loves me. And the mermaid sighed deeply, for she did not know how to shed tears. He says the girl belongs to the holy temple, and that she will never, therefore, return to the world. They will never meet again. I will stay by his side and can see him every day. I will take care of him and love him and devote my life to him. Not long after that, there was talk that the prince was going to marry and that his wife would be the beautiful daughter of a neighboring king. And that's why he was rigging out a splendid ship. They said that he was going to pay a visit to the lands of a neighboring kingdom, but in fact, he was going to visit neighboring kingdom's daughter. He was taking a large entourage with him. The little mermaid shook her head and laughed. She knew the prince's thoughts far better than anyone else. I shall have to go, he told her. I must visit this beautiful princess, my parents insist. But they would never force me to bring her back here as my wife. I could never love her. She's not at all like the beautiful girl in the temple, whom you resemble. When I have to choose a bride someday, it is much more likely to be you, my quiet little orphan child with your expressive eyes. And he kissed the mermaid's red lips, played with her long hair, and laid his head on her heart, so that she began to dream of a human happiness and an immortal soul. You are not at all afraid of the sea, are you, my dear quiet child? He asked, when they stood on board the splendid ship that was carrying them to the neighboring kingdom. He told her about powerful storms and calm waters, about the strange fish in the deep, and what divers had seen down there. She smiled at his tales, for she knew better than anyone else about the wonders at the bottom of the sea. In the moonlight night, when everyone was asleep but the helmsman at his wheel, the little mermaid stood by the railing of the ship and gazed down through the clear water. She thought she could see her father's palace, and there at the top of it was her old grandmother, a silver crown on her head as she stared up through the turbulent currents at the keel of the vessel. Then her sisters rose up to the surface and looked at her with eyes filled with sorrow, wringing their white hands. She beckoned to them and smiled and would have liked to tell them that she was happy and that all was going well for her. But the cabin boy came up just then, and the sisters dove back down, and the boy thought that the whiteness he had seen was nothing but foam on the water. The next morning, the ship sailed into the harbor of the neighboring king's magnificent capital. All the church bells were ringing, and the trumpeters blew a fanfare from the towers. Soldiers saluted with flying colors and flashing bayonets. Every day brought a new festival. Balls and banquets followed one another. But the princess had not yet appeared. It was reported that she had been raised and educated in a holy temple, where she was learning all the royal virtues. At last she appeared. The Little Mermaid was eager for a glimpse of her beauty, and she had to admit that she had never seen a more enchanting person. Her delicate skin glowed with health, and her warm blue eyes shone with deep sincerity from behind her long, dark lashes. "It's you," said the prince. "You're the one who rescued me when I was lying half dead on the beach." And he reached out and drew his blushing bride toward him. "Oh, I'm really overjoyed," he said to the Little Mermaid. "The best thing imaginable, more than I ever dared hope for, has been given to me. My happiness is sure to give you pleasure, for you are fonder of me than anyone else." The Little Mermaid kissed his hand, and she could feel her heart breaking. The day of the wedding would mean her death, and she would turn into foam on the ocean waves. All the church bells were ringing when the hurdles rode through the streets to proclaim the betrothal. Perfumed oils were burning in precious silver lamps on every altar. The priests were swinging incensers, while the bride and bridegroom joined hands to receive the blessing of the bishop. Dressed in silk and gold, the Little Mermaid was holding the bride's train, but her ears could not take in the festive music, and her eyes never saw the holy rites. All she could think about was her last night on earth, and about everything in this world that she had lost. That same evening, bride and bridegroom went aboard the ship. Cannons roared, flags were waving, and in the center of the ship a sumptuous tent of purple and gold had been raised. It was strewn with luxurious cushions, for the bridal couple was to sleep there during the calm, cool night. The sails swelled in the breeze, and the ship glided lightly and smoothly across the clear seas. When it grew dark, colored lanterns were lit, and the sailors danced merrily on deck. The Little Mermaid could not help but think of that first time she had come up from the sea, and gazed on just a sense of splendor and joy. And now she joined in the dance, swerving and swooping as lightly as a swallow does to avoid pursuit. Cries of admiration greeted her from all sides. Never before had she danced so elegantly. It was as if sharp knives were cutting into her delicate feet. But she didn't notice, for the pain in her heart was far keener. She knew that this was the last night she would ever see the prince, the man for whom she had forsaken her family and her home, given up her beautiful voice, and suffered hours of agony without his suspecting a thing. This was the last evening that she would breathe the same air that he did, or gaze into the deep sea and up at the starry night. An eternal night, without thoughts or dreams, awaited her, since she did not have a soul and would never win one. All was joy and merriment on board until long past midnight. She laughed and danced with the others, although the thought of death was in her heart. The prince kissed his lovely bride, while she played with his dark hair, and arm in arm they retired to the magnificent tent. The ship was now hushed and quiet. Only the helmsman was standing there at his wheel. The Little Mermaid was leaning on the railing with her white arms, and looking to the east for a sign of the rosy dawn. She knew that the first ray of sunlight would mean her death. Suddenly she saw her sisters rising up from the sea. They were as pale as she, but their beautiful long hair was no longer blowing in the wind. It had been cut off. "We gave our hair to the witch," they said, "so that she would help save you from the death that awaits you tonight. She gave us a knife. Take a look. See how sharp it is? Before sunrise, you must plunge it into the prince's heart. Then, when his warm blood splatters on your feet, they will grow back together to form a fishtail, and you will be a mermaid again. You could come back down to us in the water, and live out your 300 years before being changed into dead, salty sea foam. Hurry up. One of you will die before the sun rises. Our old grandmother has been so grief-stricken that her white hair started falling out, just the way ours fell to the witch's scissors. Kill the prince and come back to us. Hurry. Look at the red streaks in the sky. In a few minutes the sun will rise, and then you will die. And with a strange deep sigh, they sank down beneath the waves. The little mermaid drew back the purple curtain of the tent, and she saw the lovely bride sleeping with her head on the prince's chest. She bent down and kissed his handsome brow, then looked at the sky where the rosy dawn was growing brighter and brighter. She gazed at the sharp knife in her hand and fixed her eyes again on the prince, who was whispering the name of his bride in his dreams. She was the only one in his thoughts. The little mermaid's hand began to tremble as she took the knife. Then she flung it out far out over the waves. The water turned red where it fell, and it looked as if blood was oozing up, drop by drop, through the water. With one last glance at the prince from eyes half dimmed, she threw herself from the ship and into the sea, and felt her body dissolve into foam. And now the sun came rising up from the sea. Its warm and gentle rays fell on the deadly cold sea foam. But the little mermaid did not feel as if she were dying. She saw the bright sun and realized that there were hundreds of lovely transparent creatures hovering over her. Looking right through them, she could see the white sails of the ship and rosy clouds up in the sky. Their voices were melodious, but so ethereal that human ears could not hear them, just as mortal eyes could not behold them. They soared through the air on their own lightness, with no need for wings. The little mermaid realized that she had a body like theirs, and that she was rising higher and higher out of the foam. "Where am I?" she asked, and her voice sounded like that of the other beings, more ethereal than any earthly music. "Among the daughters of the air," they replied. "Mermaids do not have an immortal soul, and they can never have one without gaining the love of a human being. Eternal life depends on a power outside them. The daughters of the air do not have immortal souls either, but through good deeds they can earn one for themselves. We can fly to the hot countries where sultry, pestilential air takes people's lives. We bring cool breezes. We carry the fragrance of flowers through the air and send relief and healing. Once we have struggled to do all the good we can in 300 years, immortal souls are bestowed on us, and we enjoy the eternal happiness humans find. You, my dear little mermaid, have struggled with all your heart to do what we do. You have suffered and endured, and now you have been transported to the world of the spirits of the air. Through good deeds, you too can earn an immortal soul in 300 years. The little mermaid lifted her transparent arms towards God's sun, and for the first time she could feel tears coming to her eyes. Over by the ship, there were sounds of life, with people bustling about. The mermaid could tell that the prince and his beautiful bride were searching for her. With deep sorrow, they were staring out at the pearl-colored foam, as if they knew that she had thrown herself into the waves. Unseen, the mermaid kissed the bride's forehead, smiled at the prince, and then, with the other children of the air, rose up into the pink clouds that were sailing across the skies. In 300 years, we will soar like this into the heavenly kingdom, and we may arrive there even sooner, one of her companions whispered. Invisible to human eyes, we float into homes where there are children. For every day we find a good child who makes his parents happy and deserves their love. God shortens our time of trial. Children never know when we are going to fly into their rooms. And if we smile with joy when we see the child, then a year is taken away from the 300. But a mean or naughty child makes us shed tears of sorrow, and each one of those tears adds another day to our time of trial.